Hello, welcome to EPG Pathshala. This module on civil society is a part of the course on community organization. I am P.K. Shah Jahan, Professor and Chairperson for the Center for Community Organization and Development Practice at the School of Social Work, Tata Institute of Social Sciences. In this module, we are going to look at the concept of civil society. Civil society is a term which has been greatly debated, discussed globally. The relevance of civil society has become all the more relevant in terms of people's ability to demand and in a collective demand with the state as well as other institutions and structures. Civil society plays a significant role. So this module will be looking at how do we understand the concepts of civil society in the national as well as global scenario. We'll also be understanding how civil society is conceived as well as contested in the debates on governance, discussion on state and its role and development dispensation. In the process of this discussion and debate, we will try and see what forms of civil society exist in Indian national context as well as globally, which makes it possible for the people to negotiate their needs and requirements with the state, with the market. So civil society exists at the juncture of the connection between state, civil society and the market. So the civil society form an integral part of that understanding of this interconnection between these three aspects. Now, what is our general understanding of civil society? Generally, civil society is always connected with democracy. When there is no democracy, we don't talk about civil society at all. So in a way, we are saying that civil society is an entity which is mediated by democratic institutions, democratic structures of governance within the state structures. But it's always outside the state. Civil society is not considered as part of the state. So generally, in general parlance, it is talked about as autonomous institutions or collectives which are outside the bounds of the state. So it could be voluntary organizations, it could be theatre groups, it could be trade unions, it could be other church and caste panchayats, all these kind of institutions and structures which are outside the bounds of the state in terms of its daily functioning is considered as, is generally understood as civil society. Now, in order to get a little bit of clear understanding of this, I would like to look at one definition which talks about civil society as civil society refers to that autonomous public space between the family or the household and the state, excluding the market, where citizens voluntarily associate with each other in promoting what are considered as general interest or at least such shared interest of all. So what is coming out from this definition is that it is outside the family and household, it is outside the state, and also it's outside the market. Here we are bringing market as well, where the citizens voluntarily come together and form themselves as a collective to bring a collective sense so as to probably work around several issues the community is facing. So quite often in this discussion, what we are seeing is that civil societies are synonymously referred to as non-governmental organizations, the so to say NGO sector. But I think that's not giving us a full picture of what civil society is all about. So non-governmental agencies becoming the hallmark of civil society and thereby hallmark of democracy is a problematic proposition. But we consider non-governmental sector as a very important component of civil society, because that's independent of the state, that's independent of the market in one sense in its daily functioning, that's independent of the family as well. So you have certain institutions which are outside the bounds of state, outside the bounds of family, outside the bounds of market. All those formations for us at this point in time, we consider those are civil society. So what are the problematics of it? We will discuss this as we move ahead. So what has happened in the process of decreasing welfarism of the state is that state has pushed several of its functions, be it welfare, be it education, health, whatever. Some of these things have been taken over by the non-governmental sector, so to say the civil society sector. So some of the critics of civil society argue that existence of civil society or the debates of civil society or the relevance of civil society has in a way facilitated the retreat of the state from the public arena, which is probably people who are critics of neoliberal ideas talk about this as a process of facilitating retreat of the state from public arena. What we are trying to talk about is that the state functions of welfare is large amount of state functions of welfare is being taken by probably the civil society, and some are going into the profit-driven market forces as well. Say for example, I could give you the example of health insurance. Health insurance is considered as something which is a panacea for health concerns of people. So you take an insurance, so the market takes care of it and you get the benefit of it, and state doesn't have any role to play in this. So this way of taking away the role of the state and giving it to either to the state, either to the civil society or to the market is something which is happening in the process of what we call it as globalization or neoliberal ideas of state and development and things like that. So what happens is, in this situation, the state, the civil society provides some kind of an arena for resistance, which a resistance to the state, a resistance to the market. When there is a mining happening in a place, people come together and resist because it takes away the livelihoods and land and livelihoods. So it is being talked about as civil society response to it. If state brings in certain kind of policies which are not beneficial for the poor and the marginalized, people come together and resist some of these policies, or even raise concerns about it and try to make state more sensitive to the needs of the marginalized communities. So civil society has a significant role to play in how do we locate people's concerns within a system where state is retreating from several of its welfare functions or offloading some of those welfare functions to private sector, including the market. So now the question comes in, when we are talking about civil society, we talk about institutions and structures and collectives outside the bounds of the family, state and the market. But then the question comes in whether all forms of collectives are civil society or not. Another question which comes in is that, is civil society is making people to manage their own affairs directly without the facilitation of the state? So in that sense, the earlier argument of retreat of the state, is it that the idea of civil society is actually making individuals to manage their own business? Individuals in the form of collectives come together and make their own efforts to manage the situations of marginality and things like that. Finally, is it retreat of the state as a provider of equal rights to all citizens? Is that a concern? Like, is it a retreat of the state as a provider of equal rights to all citizens when we were talking about citizenship rights where state is supposed to provide this? So there are several questions of this sort which we need to probably grapple with in understanding civil society. However, the idea of civil society has become much more prominent in current days. I think we need to go back a little bit in the history to understand how this idea of civil society started coming in. Let's look at some of the historical developments and of how the civil society has been conceived and understood. Say for example, in the 13th century, the Roman Catholic Church used to be having a significant influence in the society. So when church is so much influential, there were also sections of the society who were trying to resist probably the power which is being exerted by the Catholic Church on the people in the European context. So in that kind of a context, civil society is considered as zones which are outside the papal influence. The society or sections of the society which is outside the bounds of the influence of the church. So it allowed some kind of an alternative pattern of social life and governance. It's not necessary that the state, or in that sense, in the context of the 13th century discussions, the church plays all social and developmental and governance related issues of the society. So civil society in those kind of contexts considered as something which is an alternative pattern of social life. When we move further, the 17th century, Thomas Hobbes and John Locke actually heralded the discussion on civil society. They brought in two important concepts. One is the law and governance. Presence of law and governance converts a collective body into a political society. The idea is that when you do not have a law or a rule of law or a governance structure, the collective body doesn't mean anything. So you need to have certain laws and governance which will govern the collective body or convert that collective body into a political society or a civil society. So that's existence of law and governance is an extremely important aspect of the state functioning and thereby the functioning of the civil society as well. The second aspect both Thomas Hobbes and John Locke is talking about is the primacy of rights. At the end of the day, what is important is not existence of a rule of law, whether the rights of people are protected or not. In order to protect the rights of people, you are essentially talking about formation of collectives and within the bounds of the law, obviously, and they try to negotiate for the rights of the people. If the rights are violated, and civil society can play a significant role, and this is probably guaranteed by the law. Now, again, this idea by Thomas Hobbes, in Thomas Hobbes' conceptualization, the state is known as having a common power. The state having a common power, which is known as Leviathan. This Leviathan has a common power over the people. The state of nature and the sovereignty of the state is something which is very, very important to understand this. There is a vertical relationship exists between the Leviathan and the people. Vertical relationship between the state and the people, and that's what is the common power in Thomas Hobbes' idea of governance and role of the state. So that vertical relationship between the state and the civil society is determining the common power. So the powerful state is necessary in this conception of this vertical relationship. A powerful state is necessary to maintain order and civility in the society. In the absence of a powerful state, there will not be any order, there will not be any civility. So that's the idea of common power which Thomas Hobbes is talking about. Then he also talks about horizontal relationship. Horizontal relationship is the relationship across the people in the community. What is that horizontal relationship? That horizontal relationship defines the rights, natural rights of people to probably in terms of entering into agreements, contracts and all those kind of stuff. There is a horizontal relationship which exists. So there is a need to limit the natural rights or self-interest of people and have the vertical relationship very clearly defined using a powerful state. So at the end of the day, Thomas Hobbes argues that a powerful state is essential for maintaining order and civility. So in this kind of idea, civility in that sense means respect for rule of law. It's very simple, that is respect for rule of law. If rule of law is not respected, there is no civility. There is no civility, civil society doesn't exist. It is probably an uncivil society, so to say. So this actually defines the relationship between the powerful state and the society. So the whole idea of Thomas Hobbes in terms of the contract which exists between the state and the people is based on the powerful state which exists. Now, John Locke further expands this into a social contract theory. What is a social contract theory in the context of the discussion on civil society? John Locke goes a little slower in terms of understanding the power of the state. He says that limited power but a powerful society is making society, probably civil. In the sense that the state of nature, where people are defined by their own cultural traditions and practices and things like that, they come together, constitute a public authority. It's not the Leviathan which Thomas Hobbes is talking about. It is a common public authority which is constituted by the people who comes together as a common public authority. And consolidation of this political power by the state is to be challenged because it can be an autocracy or autocratic kind of a regime. What is needed is that people need to come together and enter into a social contract among themselves, and that social contract, there is a social contract which exists between the people and the state, but the power is vested within the society, which is known as the common public authority. So in this treaty, where one is talking about that there are two treaties in this. One is the power of authority, and the power of authority is vested in the common public authority of the people, which people can enact laws and maintain laws and things like that, and even enter into contracts. So that's I think probably could be one of the basic foundations of democracy and democratic functioning. Then the second aspect of the social contract theory is the limitation of authority. No power could threaten the basic rights of people. The basic rights of people is supreme, and that limitation of authority, even the common public authority cannot threaten the rights of others. So the entire debate on common public authority and social contract within this debate on civil society comes from the very fact that there is a power of authority, and that power of authority vested within the common public within the civil society, and the limitations of authority is to the extent that it cannot threaten the basic rights of human beings. Now, moving further with this argument of John Locke, 19th century the Hegelian understanding is that civil society is a system of needs. Moving from Leviathan, the authority, coming down to common public authority, and third idea of civil society is coming from the liberal understanding of the civil society, from a Hegelian conception of the system of needs. There is a mutual recognition of the rights of self and others. You need to respect the needs of people, and there is a mutual respect. It's not that everybody is having a similar rights and needs. There are differing needs people have in the society. So there is a mutual recognition of the rights of self and others. So civil society represents a system of relations that support and enhance freedom of all. Civil society is that system which generate the kind of relationship which exists within the community, within the society, which enhances freedom for all. Everybody should have the freedom. At the same time, everybody is equally bound by the horizontal relationship which exists in the society. So this conception is a little more liberal and is more connected with the democratic principles and things like that. So the state has its own role, but at the same time, it talks about enhancing freedom of all. It is impossible for civil society to function without a public authority, the state. The civil society is insignificant. What Hegelian understanding of civil society is that civil society is insignificant when there is no authority of state. One could talk about the idea of the failed state and all those kind of situations. And then when the state fails, there is no role for civil society to play, because there is complete anarchy in those kind of contexts. So there is a subjective universal law which is applicable for everyone to follow. At the same time, there is a state-centric law which governs the relationship between the state and the people. So the subjective universal law is for everybody to respect equally, or ensure that the freedom of all is actually ensured. So this kind of conceptions coming from Hobbes, John Locke and Hegel, we move to some of the contestations of this idea of civil society. One of the classical contestations coming from Marx is that, the civil society is to be understood in the context of a nexus between the market and the political institutions. In a typical classical, class understanding of the society or the bourgeoisie state, one is talking about there is clear nexus between the economic interest and the political institutions. In that kind of a situation, the economic interest or the class factor decides the political future. Then there is problem for the role to be played by civil society. So it cannot be seen as state having complete authority. Probably one needs to talk about even changing the state as well. That's what the Marxian talking about the proletariat taking over the power and thereby outthrowing the bourgeoisie political establishment. And then Gramsci also talks about from moving on from this Marxian analysis that this kind of an authority, whatever be the level of authority, vested in the state to negotiate between the people and their rights and entitlements, it can lead to hegemony. So the state can become hegemonic. State can decide, state can even bring in laws which are anti-people. There are a lot of discussions about how state probably play to the tune of the market and bring in rules and regulations and policies which are in favor of the market and not necessarily always for the people. So the Gramsci talks about the situation where the state, the authority vested in the state can lead to hegemony. So one needs to be mindful of the fact that the state can assume power which can be hegemonic as well. So these discussions on the role of the state as deciding what would be the role of the civil society is a problematic proposition. Civil society, its own, has their own way of coming together and creating rule of law. At the same time, civility not only is respect for rule of law. Civility cannot be seen as just respect for rule of law. Why is it? Because if we have seen Arab Spring, how people have come together and defied the law and overthrew a power which is probably hegemonic or, for that matter, not necessarily in the interest of the people. So authoritarian regimes needs to be thrown out. Sometimes respect for rule of law cannot be considered as a foundation for civil society. So civil society sometimes, or civility in that sense, in broader sense, need not be always be a respect for rule of law. So there could be situations where civil society defies law in the interest of the larger society. These cannot be seen as aberrations, but these are ways of civil society functioning. Now, moving on from this idea, when we come to 20th century, 20th century is also marked by the situation where I talked about the neoliberal policies coming in as influencing many of the governance and state processes. This is a period where there is so much of disillusionment with the state has also started coming in, because many of the policies which are determined by the larger economic interest, so to say the market interest, are not necessarily probably taking care of the needs of the people. In that sense, there is a sense of disillusionment with the state evolved during the second half of the 20th century. So the loss of faith in the state to protect the interests of the people has been significant in bringing this idea of civil society into the center stage of discussion. So the response to this disillusionment with the state is coming from the Marxian understanding of the relation between economic interest and the political institutions, and also citizen participation democracies. So more citizen participation is required in democracies to function as democratic institutions. Totalitarian regimes of socialist societies, which is clear example of how Soviet Union's disintegration can be clearly seen as how those socialist societies which were totalitarian is probably rejected by the people, and disintegration of Soviet Union is a clear example of this. So in this sense, what has happened in the 20th century is that protecting the individual interest or communities against the abuse of power by the individuals, corporations and state become the basic idea of civil society. Protecting the interest of communities against abuse of power by individuals, corporations and state. So any individuals, say for example a landlord in a village, probably exploiting the labor class in those communities. It could be a multinational corporation having a unit, or a mining corporation having a mining, or a state having a policy where probably special economic zones are created where people have been thrown out of their life and livelihood situations and all. So these are situations which created a space for civil society to exert their power and probably negotiate with the state for a due share of their rights. So the idea is that civil society stand outside the state. That's pretty clear, that civil society is standing outside the state. It is not part of the state. But in absence of state, in absence of a democratic environment, the civil society also doesn't have any specific role to play, or its existence itself is in a difficult situation. So if you look at the Indian context, in a post-colonial kind of a situation where the colonialism was exerted a power on the people by an external colonial force. So at that time, people were resisting against the colonial powers. So that was a revolution from below. There was a revolution from below which overthrew the colonial, or try to resist the power of the colonial regime. So there was a revolution from below. Now what is happening in the 20th century and beyond is that a revolution from above in very many ways. When I am saying revolution from above, I mean to say the interventionist state, role of the interventionist state. The state engages with the people with revolution. You could talk about probably green revolution or white revolution, all those kind of massive policies which has impacted the life of people is also a revolution from above. So once we came out of this post-colonial kind of a situation, we were talking about revolution from above, which is interventionist state, including various policies such as MG Narega and all these could be considered as interventionist states, responses to the needs of people. But what happened is that this interventionist state could not take care of the interest of all weaker sections. So there again comes back the question of having a disillusionment with the state. The disillusionment is such that the interventionist state could not well accommodate the interest of the weaker sections. So in 1960s, we have seen the weakening of traditional agents of the political society, where the decline of Congress party could be seen as one of the significant situation in which the post-Nehru kind of a situation. The Congress party has declined. So there is a traditional agents of the political society, both the political parties and the state, has become weakened, and thereby formation of multiple parties, multiple civil society groups and things like that has created a space for beyond the state, beyond the political parties, to have agency for groups and collectives to work for the interest of the communities and the people. Now, what we are essentially talking about in the civil society debate in the Indian context is that the basis of governance by the state has been determined by profitability, market efficiency and development and national security. So these four pillars defines the basis of governance. In the process of this interventionist state and or strong state kind of an idea, where the profitability, market efficiency, development and national security form the basis of governance, then the parties, the political parties, which at some point in time thought as part of the civil society, became preoccupied with the winning next election. So next election became the target and not necessarily the concerns of people. So the parties, the political parties also moved out of the probably general interest of the people, because their preoccupation of capturing the power in the sense of having a hegemonic role. The political parties might have also played a significant role. So in this context, this is also the state when the state was completely swept in the wave of globalization. So the globalization became probably a much more larger revolution which happened from larger global context. This led to a second revolution from below. What is the second revolution? The second revolution is the mass-based agitations against the globalization process and anti-globalization movements, and even anti-capitalist kind of movements across the globe, particularly in South America and even Asia and different other parts of the world. The revolution from below is also coming from within the national context, not against a kind of a colonial power, but a very, very powerful market power, which is a global market power. So we have seen anti-caste movements, we have seen gender rights movement, we have seen project affected people coming against big development projects. We have also seen LGBT rights, lesbian, gay and bisexual, transsexual communities, LGBT communities rights. These were different mass-based democratic struggles which started coming into as part of this civil society kind of responses. So in the 1970s and 80s also took civil society to a political imagination, like the various merger of ideas of political society and civil society came together. Several political associations have joined hands, or maybe several political agitations or people's agitations have taken the shape of political parties and political, you could take the example of Telangana movement and things like that, and those becoming Telangana Rashtra Samiti and the political parties. So these are all movements of people, civil society movements of people which assume the role of political society. So at the end of the day, what we are talking about civil society as a challenge to the hegemony of the ruling class, be it the state or other forms including the market. Civil society also provided a space for humane governance or democratizing governance or democratizing the state. So civil society could function as a medium where humane governance or a democratizing of governance could be achieved. It also provides resistance to the behemoth state, which implements, which probably even takes certain anti-people policies. So civil society could provide a kind of a resistance to the state's functioning as well. At the end of the day, what we are trying to see is that emancipation, which we consider as a process of coming out of the oppression and things like that, is not possible without a strong civil society. So civil society is extremely important, not only for agitations and movements and protests and all, but also to make sure that the state functions within its bounds in ensuring welfare and development of the people. Now, moving on from this global analysis and also the analysis in the Indian context, where we were talking about the situations which has emerged to make civil society's role, I would like to talk about some of those Indian authors who have talked very clearly about civil society and its role. Rajini Kothari associates civil society with people-centric institutions. So Rajini Kothari formed a civil society activist organization called Locke. The idea of Locke was to bring civil society movements together at the grassroots. So if we could bring as a platform, Locke was a platform to bring civil society movements together at the grassroots level. So he considers civil society as people-centric institutions. The essential central aspect of civil society is the people-centric institution. Now further, Andre Bethé also talks about, civil society with individual freedom and social non-discrimination. Civil society provides individual freedom and social non-discrimination. Civil society cannot be a formation which discriminates one against the other. In that sense, any community institutions or social groups which discriminates one against the other or curtail the freedom of somebody else cannot be considered as civil society. In that sense, probably Kha Panchayat, it's a association, but that cannot be considered as a civil society as far as Andre Bethé is concerned. So when we talk about civil society as independent of the state, does it mean that all institutions and collectives within the framework of rule of law form civil society? There are several institutions and structures which are within the rule of law, but does it all these becomes civil society? It need not be. If you consider Andre Bethé's idea of non-discrimination as basis of civil society, probably all institutions which are outside the state or collectives or even working within the rule of law need not be civil society. Then what about the collectives and movements which actually propagate division and exclusion? If there are movements which creates exclusion and division within the society, can it be considered as civil society? The analysis of the previous discussions on Andre Bethé and Rajni Kothari doesn't give us an impression that those kind of movements can be considered as civil society. If some civil society organizations resist hegemonic rule of law, can it be considered as civil society? There is a problem, and because if there is a hegemonic rule of law exists, resistance to hegemonic rule of law cannot be considered as outside the civil society or outside the civility, because that's also necessary for ensuring that people's rights and entitlements are protected. So what is necessary for understanding civil society is that a rights-based conception of civility over adherence to rule of law and state of nature is important. A rights-based conception of civility is much more important than a rule of law-based idea of civility. So civility essentially means that it has to ensure the rights of people or keep the primacy of rights as a benchmark for identifying civil society. And it's also important that when you're talking about civil society, we also need to understand there is something called global civil society. Global civil society came to the picture, it's alongside the process of globalization. The globalization of resistance to power has also gone globalized. So if you look at the 1999 protesters in Seattle or the Greenpeace actions, which is a counterweight to the global capitalism, some of these global protest, or even for that matter, World Social Forum, some of these forums created a sense that civil society is not something which is defined by territorial national states. It can be global. Because global governance if global governance is possible, global governance comes with global power. So global governance is possible, global power is existing, resistance or even for that matter negotiation of people's rights also become global. If you look at the issue of Union Carbide in the context of Bhopal tragedy, the resistance to Union Carbide has not only been limited to India, it has gone global. And even there were situations where several educational institutions across the globe has resisted recruitment by Dow Chemicals, which has taken Union Carbide in India. So they have resisted, they have even boycotted recruitment by Dow Chemicals. So these are processes which are probably local in nature but has a global repercussions. So all these things becomes necessary for us to understand that civil society is not something which is bound by the state within a national territory, but the power or the governance which exists. If there is global governance possible, global civil society is also needed and possible. So this formation of IBRD, World Bank and IMF and all these things are institutions of global power, and that global power also created spaces for global resistance, global protest, global collectivization of people and things like that. So, but global civil societies it is comparatively difficult to define global civil society, and because of the fact that it is a fuzzy concept and things like that. So this too, what we are trying essentially to say is that finally we need to look at what are the things which we consider as civil society. Civil society as an autonomous institution that exists independent of the state. The civil society is also considered as an arena for the marginalized to collectivize themselves and struggle for their own, demanding their needs and entitlements. It also has several mediating institutions and that link individuals to each other and negotiate between citizens and the state, and the idea of global civil society, which is relevant in an interconnected world. You may refer to the text given in the module. There are also a very limited list of references which is given for further understanding. Thank you so much.